as we get started. But I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country we're meeting on today. We recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters, and we pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations here at the conference today. My name's Faith and I'll be your chair for today. This afternoon's talks will explore novel and provocative concepts within the field of resource monitoring, and it should be quite interesting. We have a diverse lineup of speakers representing different functions and organisations. We've got people from Europe, a speaker from Europe. We've got someone from the US, Canada and Australia. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kevin Haase. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's from the Institute of the Baltic Sea Fisheries in Germany. And Kevin's talk today explores the use of agent-based models in understanding the decision-making of humans in the rec fisheries socio-ecological system.
So thanks for the nice introduction, and welcome to my talk about agent-based models. And first of all, I think we all know that recreational fisheries have a high number of individual participants, and the extent of the impact of recreational fishery depends crucially on the decisions and the behavior of these individuals. But anglers are highly heterogeneous, as we heard in other talks today. They differ in demographics and in things like their skill level or how important is fishing for their lives. And this individual process leads to individual expectation and also intentions, what they want to do, which is influenced by other anglers and the management. And out of this process comes then the real behavior. And this determines the impact of recreational fishing. So where someone goes fishing determines where, for example, money is spent, but also how much fish is caught. This behavior will feed back in the angler due to an experience. And now I want that we have this little background about anglers and how this individual process works. I want to come to the case study, which is the German recreational Western Baltic cod fishery. So we are here in the center of Europe. Cod is an ecological key species, as is the main predator and also the main target species of the rec and commercial fishery. However, the cod stock has collapsed. I will be a little bit quick since we only have 50 minutes. But you can see that we are now here under biological reference points. One main reason for it is the high commercial catches over a long period of time. In an effort to rebuild the stock, the commercial quotas was decreased, which we can see on the light gray area here. The recreational catches were quite stable but fluctuating over time. So we ended up here in a situation where the recreational catches had a high share on the total removals in this fishery. Therefore, managers decided to introduce a back limit here in 2017. That was the first time introduced a back limit in the Baltic Sea, so something really special there, not as here in Australia where every fish has a back limit. And this was like a management shock for the fisheries. So the next year's assessment revealed that the real reduction from this back limit was twice as much as expected. So, and possible reasons for this are, on the one hand, the stock decline, but on the other hand, also behavioral changes of the fishes. So the participation rate decreased and also travel distances decreased. So tourist anglers from southern Germany, for example, didn't come up to the coast anymore. The goal of my PhD project now was to better understand the decisions and behavior of anglers. And due to this individual processes, method that we can use is our ABMs, so agent-based models. And what we did now, we focused on the side shots, so where the anglers go fishing. And here on the map, we can see the real travel behavior of German anglers. That's only like day trips, so that just this is like 3 hours drive here, one furthest distance is 3 hours drive. And with our ABM, we will later try to recreate this pattern that we see here on the map. But first of all, what are ABMs? Have anyone experience with ABMs? Okay, there was the one. So ABM is a bottom-up approach. This means we model the micro-level behavior and decisions of individuals, and this micro-level behavior then lead to macro-level patterns like the travel distance we saw before. The individuals, so in our case the anglers, are represented as agents, and they can be super realistic in terms of socio-demographics, their interaction with each other, how they communicate, and also include concepts like specialization, for example. The individual decisions of these agents can be modeled with a broad range of decision theories. I don't want to go in too much detail here, but there's a lot of literature about it. And in the end, fully implemented ABM can be seen as a toolbox to test different mechanisms and try out different hypotheses. So I want to now to present the ABM that we created. It's really simple right now, but I think it's good, especially as you don't have experience with ABM, to understand the idea. So first, we had 10,000 angler agents in our model. They were really simple. They just had an ID to identify them. They had a zip code, so a place where they live, and a preferred fishing method. On the other hand, we had 110 fishing locations along the German coast that were harbors or beaches where they go fishing. Just a name also to identify them, a fishing method that is possible at the location, and for each fishing method, an average catch over the last 5 years. And then we started an explorative modeling approach, which lead in the end to this graph, which looks much more complicated than it actually is. But we will break it down a little bit. We started here in this area, and this area basically shows us we have 3 data sources at the beginning, one paper that have examined the travel patterns, and then 2 national services that delivers us catch rates and stuff like that. And then we built our first model here where the site choice was just completely random. Nothing else. Of course, it was not realistic, but it gave us a baseline scenario to compare the next models with. I just mentioned that this random model, MR in blue, was not realistic, but how we checked is it's shown in this area. So we had 4 macro-level patterns that we tried to recreate. First one, it was the location, the number of locations that they visit, the angler distribution between the locations, so which locations are visited most often, the travel distances from each home location to the access points, and a visual travel pattern comparison. The first range of models that we developed are up here that focus on the catches. So first of all, to have the provenance and how we build the model right, we need another data sources, that is the average catches, and then the model CA1. And now we have the first decision rule really in the model, and that is the probability to choose a location is proportional to the expected catches, so to the average catches from a location. This assumes that anglers are not completely rational in terms of catches, so they don't only go to the highest catch location, and also value other things that are not modeled yet, or they have just an imperfect knowledge, but better locations have a higher probability to be identified as productive ones. And now an example of the comparison of these macro-level patterns I talk about a lot. So here's the real world macro-level patterns, and here the macro-level patterns that came out of our model, and we can directly see that doesn't fit together, so we know we need to do another model. This was here C1b. There we changed just from average catch to average harvest. Doesn't improve the output, so next model is C2, and this time we came back to the average catches, but restricted the knowledge of the angler. So in this model, each angler agents only know 10 random chosen locations. This very simple reduction in the knowledge improved the model output. So even from this very simple models, we can now say, okay, the catches are maybe more important than the harvest, and knowledge constraints seems to play a role in the angler side shots. Something that could explain the knowledge constraints are the distances from home to the fishing location. So we developed a next strain of models focusing on the distance. So again, a new data source, thus the distances inside there, and then a first really simple model, D1. The angler chooses the shortest distance, so that means they are completely rational in terms of cost. They just want to minimize the cost. Was not realistic. Next model, D2. This time the distance was implemented as a restricting factor. So each home location got a maximum distance, and in this distance they choose randomly the location. And now we make this comparison again, and we see now that this comparison between the model output and the real world got a little better already. So we seem to be on the right way. But to compare the both models, the catch models were better in reproducing the angler distribution, which can be seen here as an example for boat anglers. I just marked the best values in bold, so MC1 created the values closest to the real world. But on the other hand, the distance models were better at reproducing the travel patterns, which we saw just before, and can also be seen in the mean travel distance. There we have the smallest difference to reality again. Single factor, we're not able to reproduce all macro level patterns, so we combined the model together and the factors together. The first one just basically put C2 and D2 together, but in the end we came up with a utility approach. And there we have a parameter A that weighted the importance of the catches and the distance against each other. So a smaller A means a higher importance of the distance, and vice versa, A of 1, highest importance of catches. And this approach allows us to make a parameter scan of A, so we vary R from 0 to 1, and check how this affects our model outcomes. And we see here that the optimal value of A varies with the fishing method. So for charter boat, the green line, the smallest value of A reproduces the smallest distance to the reality and is therefore the best model, which means basically that charter boat anglers just choose the next harbor to their location. While for the other fisheries, the output is a little bit more complex. So in summary, what we can say is that an explorative modeling workflow allowed to test different behavioral assumptions against each other and the real-world data, and that even with this really, really simple ABM, it can be much more complex. We can have a real stock inside there, we can have communication between the agent and so on. But also with a simple ABM, we get insight about the decision-making of anglers, but as I mentioned already, more work is needed, so we need more heterogeneous agents of different skill levels, for example. The agents need to have a long and a short-term memory based on their own experience in the model. And also we need a communication between the agents. So for example, they communicate, okay, I go to this location, I caught much fish there, and other anglers go there as well. I think we all know that. And also we need more realistic catch rates, so we need a stock in behind that moves around in the sea. So that's basically it. Since I just heard no one of you have really experience about ABM, maybe you have any questions. I think we have 2 minutes left for a short question.
We've got time for a quick question.
Yeah.
So your movement data was mostly in the last 5 years after the bag limit reduction?
Sorry, again.
The bag limit reduction was, your movement data was 5
Yeah.
years data.
No, the movement data was Before the back limit?
Before the back?
Yeah, we use the data that we got before the back limit, so it's not affected by the back limit because it changed afterwards. And the first step is to build an ABM that recreate really this macro level patterns we saw in the unregulated fishery.
Yeah.
And then try to also validate the ABM with recreating the changes we see afterwards. Because in the end, we want to use the ABM to, like, a new regulation is put in, how do the anglers react?
Yes,
So,
that was the question
yeah.
I thought you were going to answer, but you haven't quite got there yet.
No, we haven't quite got there yet, actually. And I think to answer this complex question, the ABM is too simple right now. We need real catch rates, for example, to have that. And also, it's not only the side short there. Then we need also an effort decision and more decisions of the agents to answer this question.
Thank you, Kevin. Our next speaker is Sean Meehan from NOAA. He's a rec coordinator at NOAA, and his talk will examine whether the impact of advancing fishing technologies should be researched, and whether or not it should be incorporated into management, which should be very exciting. So, I don't know why this isn't working. Is that it?
Perfect. Thank you, Faith.
Beautiful.
Would you mind if I stood over here? Is that all right with everybody? I'll try and speak up. Who has heard of the term technological creep or effort creep as it relates to fisheries? Fantastic. So we're not going to talk about this technological creep, which many people think of when they hear the term at first. Technological creep is kind of defined in this top from an article in Penn Live, and ever-improving, more sophisticated technology. So advancements in machinery, advancements in materials that make our techniques, our industries better and more efficient. There was an article by Nikki Holmert in Seafood Source talking about a study that looked at over 50 other studies that talked about commercial fishing fleets and their capacity doubling. That actual publication was this in 2019 by Palomares and Pauly. And again, they looked at 51 studies analyzing commercial creep in commercial fisheries. Now, as scientists, a thing is not a thing until that thing has been published in a peer-reviewed journal in a paper. So I was looking into this question. It met that criteria. There are papers on the commercial side of things. There are also papers on the recreational side. You'll recognize a few of these authors in here, and one, Andy Danilchuk, is actually here. He was at this conference. So we have some people who are really looking at this, bright people, into these questions. There's also essays on this thing about the impacts of technological creep in recreational fishing. So who am I and why do I care about this? So I'm a recreational fishing coordinator for NOAA Fisheries in the Southeast United States. I work with fishermen as a liaison, if you will, between the federal fisheries and millions of anglers in that region of the United States. I'm here with a cohort of other NOAA folks, a couple of which I want to mention. There's Ken Brennan, clearly a better fisherman than I am from the picture. He works more or less on the wet side of the house. I work on the dry side of the house at NOAA, if you want to think of it that way. And then there's Russ Dunn, who gave a talk yesterday. Ken is talking tomorrow. He's on the national level, so he works with us in the regional areas, more on the national level with upper levels of management in NOAA and fisheries proper. So I kind of want to go over the regions we have here in the United States. Again, I'm in the South Atlantic. We have millions of anglers. We have tens of millions of recreational trips every year, and that results in billions of dollars. Now, NOAA sits under the Department of Commerce, and as you can see from these numbers, commerce is an important part of fisheries in the United States. These are massive numbers, 1.7 million jobs, 253 billion in sales. This is commercial and recreational. This is nationwide. And 117 billion in value added. We talk about this in the context of a blue economy, right? These are industries that affect things that work in and around the ocean, marine resources, and coastal communities, right? So, talking about coastal communities, I'm sure it's the same in many nations here in the room. Our coastal communities basically have 40% of our population. 10% of the coastline land area has 40% of the population. We also see increases in populations moving to the coast. So that top figure there, 34.8 million people moved to the coast in 1970 to 2010. So we have very highly densely populated coastal regions, and we have growing coastal regions. And in my state, Florida, you can see the red is the highly dense area, so predominantly in the coast. You can imagine a fair percentage of those folks want to go fishing. They move there to enjoy the resources. They want to go fishing, so increasing potential population of recreational anglers. So I was just trying to think about the difference between commercial and recreational fishing. I'm sure people much smarter than me have gone through this as an exercise, but this is me sharing my thoughts with you guys. Commercial fisheries look at pounds of fish, right? That's how they're measured, that's how they're counted, that's what they do. They want to get this in the shortest amount of time, right? Because that's less cost to the crew, less cost to the vessel, fuel, food, lower business cost. They want to go when the market price is highest, right? As a business model that makes all the sense in the world. This model is time, it is speed, it is efficiency. You want to get product, you want to get inventory, and you want to move it quickly. That's not the same, I don't think, for recreational fishermen, at least in the conversations I've had with my constituents. They want open access to fishing. They want year-round opportunities because they are like us. They're scientists, they're plumbers, they're hairstylists, they're doctors. They work, and then in their free time, they go fishing. They don't want closed seasons, but they really don't want closed areas. That's something that we've heard over and over again. They do want some fish for food, but a maximum amount of pounds doesn't equal to the maximum enjoyment or value of a recreational fishing day. So it's not equal in that sense. Making memories with family and friends. And I put here tournaments and competitions. It's kind of a weird one that's in there, but I didn't want to leave that one out, if you will. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of my view of technological creep through my childhood, as you were. I'm old enough that I didn't have the internet stuff. We had magazines. And my mom and dad made me a fishing subscription, so I couldn't wait till they came in. And he had slick, cool, cutting-edge technology advertisements like this. So this was some of the new initiatives or technologies available to fishermen. Who remembers these things? Yeah. So remember, we call them fish finders. I mean, how could you not want a fish finder, to use on your boat? It uses sound through a transducer, and you get these little red flashes on a circular dial. And with a little bit of magic or Hogwarts degree, you can interpret this as habitat, as fish, and all sorts of things. This technology is still being used today. It's very popular with ice fishermen, believe it or not, just portability and whatnot. Advances from here went to paper machines. This is what I remember. My dad was a part-time charter boat captain. I remember this machine. It took minutes to warm up. It's a paper scroll, like a receipt you see on a cash register, and it goes across, and there's a ink pen on a loop, and it goes across, and it translates bounce-back signals into arcs, which represent fish and whatnot on the bottom. This thing scared me to death. To me, it weighed 5,000 pounds, and if it fell on me, I would die as a 10-year-old kid. Technology advanced. These giant boxes got smaller, much like our TVs. They went from paper screens to electronic screens, first monochrome, and then multicolor displays. The boxes got smaller. They went from tubes to more technology like flat screen TVs. And these days we have these multifunctional screens that are now touchscreen. So advances in that sort of thing was really impressive over the years. So now they're small, they can get on smaller boats, right? Really lightweight, like our TVs. Flat screen TVs are very light these days. In addition to that, there's advancements in the actual sound transducers. Traditionally, they just bounce sound waves in a single wavelength or frequency, if you will. Today, we use chirp. This is compressed, high-intensity radar pulses. So they send out pulses in multiple frequencies, and they're able to send clear signals. You can see on the left is a traditional kind of fish finder or depth sounder. Over here, you can see the individual fish lining up. So as you can see, the power is increasing for recreational anglers. You match this chirp image on the left with side cam going on the right. Clearly, we can see this is a bridge that was flooded in some sort of impoundment. You can see the trestles and supports on the one side. You can see kind of the support on the bottom there. You can see the thermocline, which is that line across the top. Again, you see this power increasing at the hands of fishermen. Smaller size, more power. You add side-scan sonar with very detailed bathymetric maps. You can add that to an autopilot. You can have your boat drive whatever points you want on the map. You can have a spot lock trolling motor hold you in place without an anchor anywhere you want on this map. So again, see this power just multiplying and multiplying. The newest thing is Omni Sonar. This is an incredible 360 sonar. It costs about $200,000 US installed in your vessel. It has a range out to 5,000 feet from the boat. And those of you who live in countries that aren't holding onto the English system with a death grip, that's about 1.5 kilometers. So you can imagine the power of this is amazing. The language here isn't so important. It's just a bunch of tournament fishermen saying, we kind of need to self-regulate this thing because not everyone can afford it, and it's really powerful. You can see this image up top. Arguably, that's a billfish. People who know how to use this can tell the front end from the back end of a billfish, what direction it's swimming and where it's going. You can put your baits right in front of it. So that's an incredible advantage if you're a tournament fisherman with a lot of money on the line. So amazing technology. And I know this sounds like a commercial for electronics in true fashion, but wait, there's more. This is my favorite. This is a fish map. It is a subscriber service you get from Sirius XM. It's supported by numerous platforms, Raymarine, Furuno. There's a group of oceanographers that look at remote sensing data like sea surface temperatures, sargassum lines, plankton lines, and twice a week they update your machines. And so you can go and you can pick what species you're interested in. And all this information is fed into your machine, and then a polygon will show up on your map, and that's your highest chance of encountering that particular species of fish. So the power at people's fingertips, or the recreational fishing fingertips, is amazing. So this is now the recreational fishing tactic. Look at all the power at his or her fingertips. Yes, 5. So, good. Amazing. Let's talk about the platforms that these sit upon. In the old days, you know, Hemingway's Pilar and all these other beautiful wood boats cruising through the water at 10, 12 knots with some temperamental gas engine, right? You have the quintessential tri-hull with a Mercury engine that may or may not start and may or may not run and produces copious amounts of black smoke, right? We've all been there on the two-cycle engines. There's really little to no electronics on this boat but a compass and a pile of fish in the front. No radio, no cell phone to call if you're in danger, so they really generally didn't roam very far. Advancements were like this Hatteras over here. That's the boat my dad had when he was a commercial captain. What do we have today? We have improvements in technology, cold vacuum fiberglass molds, Kevlar, carbon fiber. We have outboard engines that just weigh mere hundreds of pounds, but these on the bottom are 600 horsepower. That's 3,000 horsepower on the back of that boat. These can run hundreds of miles. They carry hundreds of gallons of fuel. These boats average 40 knots cruising speed, including that 82-foot Viking with 3 engines in that thing. So think of the power now that recreational fishermen have, the range, the ability to find fish and harvest fish. So you can see as we're advancing, and it's not stopping, these are just going and going and going. So I want to go back to this one paper that I mentioned earlier, and it talks about the rate. These two researchers, said about a 2.41% in the commercial fleet power every year. So it doubles every 35 years. So 10 boats in 1988 are now fishing with a power of 20 boats today due to technology, and that's going more and more and more. The other paper I mentioned, where Dr. Danilchuk is here, looked at a variety of other things I haven't even talked about that is available to recreational fishermen, increasing their power to harvest and locate fish. And what they talked about a lot, and I didn't even get to, is social media, which you all in the room are aware of how powerful it is. So people can YouTube their way to become wonderful fishermen. And they reduce that intimidation factor. What bait do I use? Where do I go? They can YouTube it. They can Facebook friends it. And all these sort of things. So what? A dead fish is a dead fish, some would argue, right? And if you are a commercial fisherman, pounds are pounds. If you are a biological scientist, as long as you're capturing that dead fish from a biomass or from a population, you don't care if it was a pink lure or had 4 engines or 1 engine on the boat, right? You want to capture that fish for the data. But for the recreational angler, and the ones I'm talking to, it's not the pounds or the maximum amount of pounds. It is the enjoyment on the day. It is sharing with family and friends. So, and then the economists are going to argue that as well. So are recreational fishermen, by embracing all this technology, their own worst enemy? Are they in a race to the bottom being overfishing and overfished populations? So, selfishly, I don't know if you guys are talking about it. We're starting to talk about it. I would love to hear from you. If you are thinking about it, is it important to you? Is it an important subject? And if so, should we all be talking about it? Because I think this is a universal problem that's confronting us all in recreational fisheries. And that's all I have. So hopefully I'm within time. And I know I raced through it, but thank you guys.
We do have about 1 minute.
Okay. We can wait till the end too. Whatever's best for you, Faith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would you?
Oh,
No.
no, we can wait, no.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, we'll wait till the end, and that way we'll at least be able to get
Yeah, I know.
everyone in. Next, I'd like to introduce Nathan, who I work with. I'm lucky enough to work with him, not the other way around. Nathan's a senior scientist at New South Wales DPI, and his talk today discusses the theoretical framework, or a theoretical framework used to preemptively determine the data requirements for harvest strategy development for the New South Wales freshwater recreational fishery. So I'll just get his slides up.
All right, thank you for that, Faith. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the monitoring program we've been developing for the New South Wales recreational freshwater fishery. I'd just like to give a special thanks to Martin de Graaf, who was our research leader at the time we started developing this, but unfortunately had a serious medical event and had to end up retiring from our department. But a lot of the ideas that we'll be presenting today were built with him as our research leader. And also thanks to Tom, who's pictured in the middle there, that actually does a lot of the field work and a lot of the hard work for this project. So the New South Wales freshwater recreational fishery is quite a varied fishery. We go from high mountain streams where we have trout stocked in them to these lowland rivers where we have our iconic Murray cod and golden perch. And we also have a diadromous fish on the coast, an Australian bass, which moves up and down, which also forms an important part of a recreational fishery. And all those species are also stocked in these large impoundments we have across the state. So developing a monitoring program, which is basically the staff of Tom and I and some casual staff behind it, for that whole area is quite a challenging aspect for us to look at. So we sort of started to work out over the last few years with that help from Martin at the start how we would approach that. So a bit of a history on the recreational fishery in freshwater in New South Wales. It has primarily focused on trout for the last few hundred years, I suppose. There was these acclimatisation societies which were responsible for the stocking and the management and the regulations and the licensing around that trout fishery. Up until about the 1960s, till the state government took over that. The native freshwater fishery was primarily a harvest fishery, and it was similar to what was going on with the commercial fishery, basically big strings of cod taken out of the river and used for food consumption. The commercial fishery did run for a short period of time, but basically finished in the 1960s and then trickled out and was actually formally closed in the 1990s. So apart from the legislation or the regulation that the acclimatisation societies had in place, the state government did have some fairly minor interventions in terms of management, like stopping dynamite fishing. But generally there wasn't too much sort of regulation around recreational fishing in New South Wales for the first few hundred years. That has since changed. We have moved into more of a catch and release based fishery in our freshwater environments in New South Wales. The work that Faith has been doing with the statewide telephone and diary survey with our anglers has showed that, you know, even for Murray cod, we're looking at a harvest rate of only about 10% across our fishery now. So this has brought about a number of these strategies to help improve the survivability of release fish and stuff over the last few decades. And Faith will be talking tomorrow more about that RFMP program tomorrow, about how that data is being collected. So our government organisation has now started looking at how we manage our recreational fisheries, and this is a little excerpt I took off our website yesterday. But what I want to highlight there is that we're also, although we're trying to manage the total harvest, we're also trying to make sure there is an equal share to that angling experience for all anglers in New South Wales. So making sure they have access to those fisheries, can easily get to the fisheries and partake in that pastime. And behind that, we do have a number of different guiding policies. So although we're working towards these harvest strategies in the future, we do have some other policies there that we have been working to over the last 20 or 30 years. These can be species and location-specific strategies, such as the Snowy Lake strategy. We do have a number of different water sharing plans and things like that that do have objectives related to recreational fishing. Some of our aquatic species, like Murray cod, did have to go through a recovery program, so there's some objectives in there that are relevant to recreational fishing. And then we have some internal strategic plans and stocking strategies too, which we work towards. But what was evidence in all these is that we needed to have a more scientific approach to the management that we're doing, and management that was backed by research. So this is a slide that I've taken off one of my other colleagues that will present tomorrow about harvest strategies in recreational fisheries. But really what we're talking about is setting up these objectives, having a range of different performance indicators, and when we go below that a certain level there, it's going to trigger a management response. And that's sort of where we're looking at going to. So the title of my talk about putting the cart before the horse, basically we're trying to collect this data for a future harvest strategy that may happen. So we're trying to work out how we can go about doing that. And the thing we've got within our freshwater is that it is dominated by that catch and release fishery. So harvest strategies often get a little bit of a question mark when we bring them up in public. Is that the right approach to be using? So that's why we're trying to collect the data using that style of approach, seeing what happens with that strategy in the future. We do have harvest controls in our freshwater recreational fisheries. We have all the usual ones: bag limits, length-based regulations, closures, gear restrictions, and we do monitoring around that, or we have in the past. But it is heavily complicated by the stocking that we do. We do a lot of stocking. Our trout fishery is pretty well dominated by the stocking that we do. So how does that actually fit into that process of developing those management plans and strategies? And the real thing is controlling harvest our highest priority in these environments? So you may have seen some of the talks today about the droughts and stuff that we've been through. Much of the state went through the worst drought it's ever seen over the last a few years ago. So these are some of the waterways that these acclimatisation societies have been stocking for well over 100 years. And during that drought, they're actually completely dry, or down to isolated pools. And then on top of that, we have these introduced species which also come in. So it really gets us to thinking about, and maybe the public do have a bit of a point, is should we be calling them harvest strategies, or should we be looking at other management alternatives to them? So what we did is we then sat down and for each species worked out some of the key objectives that we would want to identify for each, that we wanted to work through for each of those species. And these included some general ones that we developed with the managers, some that was in those pre-existing plans, and there was some more sort of detailed operational sort of objectives sitting under these. And then we worked out what indicators we would currently have, whether or not we had funding for it or projects currently running that would be able to address those indicators, and where we could potentially get funding in the future. So started mapping out those research and monitoring priorities over the next few years. And we did find we had some pretty decent amounts of data for both fishery dependent and independent data indicators. So the RFMP that I talked about that Faith works on is a really good one that gives us that indication across the entire state over every few year period. But we do also have some creel surveys which are completed kind of sporadically, and both in time and across the state. So we've had trout creel surveys done right back into the 1970s, but generally it's only one every decade or something that we do them, and they're not at the same location, so they're not really giving us any good time series of data for those indicators. Where we do excel is with our fishery independent monitoring, mostly through our biodiversity surveys. We have in our database, I think, over 14,000 sites that we've surveyed, 2 million fish records, mostly through boat electrofishing, and that does allow us to have some of these time series indicators on catch per unit effort and stuff like that across our state. But we still do have gaps there, and this is some work that one of my colleagues has just done recently on Murray cod, so definitely we can see some time series data there, which helps us address some of those potential objectives that we'll have. And the three main data gaps, or the priorities that we saw at the beginning of this program, was trout, dams and people, and I'll just run through quickly what we're doing in each of those areas. So our trout fishery is generally high up in the catchment, well away from most of that work that we're doing with the boat electrofishing for our native sort of focused species. So we were lacking a little bit there, and we were also copying quite a lot of flack about how poor our trout fishery was going then. cold water species are going through one of the worst droughts in record, so it's probably not surprising that we weren't having the best fishery. But we did bring in as many of the stakeholders as we could involved with that trout fishery at the time to try and work with them to set some objectives around that fishery, developing monitoring programs and doing all that sort of stuff with them. And one of the key things that we needed was some stream monitoring on how our trout fisheries were going. So what we did in this program is we were trying to develop these time series and catch per unit effort data across our fishery. And that was, I guess, the real goal, was to start developing that time series and data, but we wanted to make sure we were giving short-term feedback to both the anglers and the managers throughout this whole process. We didn't want to try and set up a program which had no sort of intermediate sort of feedback to the anglers. So we tried to make sure we give something back to them, and we try and give back to them every year or multiple times every year. And the way we're doing that with our trout monitoring is that we have a range of different sites across the state that we sample every single year, and then we produce these report cards similar to what you'd see for your kids at school. So we've got a range of different criteria, they get different scores with those. And this was really focused originally towards giving it back to those anglers so they could see how their fishery was tracking, but it also started showing up some really useful stuff for our managers as well. So say, for example, some of the criteria here is, have we got recent recruitment or stocking success there, and we're giving it Bs for this category. But then if we look to the mature fish for rainbow trout, which is that one there, they got an F for that. So there was basically no mature fish there. They were surviving that initial stocking, but then they wouldn't get through that first summer period. So that could then feed back to the managers, and maybe they redirect their stocking effort elsewhere or into the dams or something where we get better survival, and maybe not stock there during these really dry periods. So very useful for that. Another important part of our trout fishery is our I don't know why there's sound coming off that. There's our high mountain lakes. I'll try and talk over it. And these lakes are worth up to about $70 million a year, these fisheries. And we didn't really, and so what the fish do out of these lakes is they migrate up into the rivers every year. And we didn't really have a good way of, I can't turn it off, a very good way of monitoring that fishery. And we were also getting some negative feedback. So this is basically a year worth of data here. We were getting reports that the fish were still migrating past the end of our close season, which is at the end of October. So again, with that view of having that long-term time series of data, so we're getting data on this every year through our use of these fish counters that we'd installed into the waterway, we were getting that long time series of data, but we also wanted to provide that short-term feedback to both the anglers and managers so they could see what was happening. This is a live website they can go in there and look at. But it also allowed us to to ease those concerns around the actual closure being effective. So what we could see was that most of our fish, 95% of our fish, were actually migrating during the close season. When the season opened back up, we could see, well, yes, we did get a few fish still move up there, which was those little green dots there, but generally there wasn't much of a concern there. So that really eased the concerns of our stakeholders, made our managers' lives easier. They could move on with other more pressing concerns in their fisheries. So the next thing that we wanted to work on was our dams. We stock on a range of large dams, and these are a very large dam, some of these. But we didn't really have a really good way of monitoring what was going on in these impoundments. We had tried to do netting, electrofishing surveys, but just given the size of these systems, that was quite difficult. And also the variation in the lake levels. So we wanted to be able to come up with a method that would allow us to survey regardless of the lake level. And we partnered with InfoFish. So some of you may have seen Stefan's talk yesterday on the use of hydroacoustics. So they're basically using these scientific echo sounders, and we came up with a monitoring program to allow us to achieve this. Again, developed to build that long-term time series of data of actually estimating the biomass and full biomass in each of these impoundments every 2 to 5 years. And but also providing that short-term feedback to anglers by providing these maps straight back out to them. So what we found was that it was a really good way for us to estimate the biomass, so regardless of the percentage. So Copen and Dan there, we did it first at 16.5%. We did it last year or earlier this year, I think at over 100%. We've had one dam we had to sample at 140% because of the floods we've had. And it just allows us to get the detections on the certain size of fish and average detections per hectare, as well as generate that overall biomass. So we're developing those indicators for the impoundment that we can use for those future strategies in the future. And the final thing that I wanted to talk about was people. And Rachel gave a talk very early on yesterday about the work that they're doing on the sort of statewide social and economic value of these fisheries. And that's really what we're talking about with people, is that social and economic indicators within these fisheries. So what we wanted to do here was actually support or provide a supplement to that statewide data by doing some on-ground work. So we've been working with Nick McLean and Rachel and Alistair that are in the audience here to try and develop those indicators where we can go out and do short, sharp, intensive surveys, not necessarily there to gain overall expenditure in that fishery, but to get an indicator of what's going on in that fishery where we measure the same thing every few years. So that's what we're doing there. And we're also doing some citizen science projects there, and that's what those other graphs are there. And the key with those is often it's just a minor tweak to within the citizen science programs we're talking about tournament monitoring. It's a minor tweak to the methods or the rules for their tournament, where we're starting to get them to record all the catch they get. So everything that's your left of that line was previously not recorded. And that's just a length frequency diagram there. So it was only the small amount of data that was on the other side of it. That small rule change allowed us to get all that other data. And some of our clubs are already collecting that data as well as effort data. So we were able to track back to 1995 with some of that and get that time series data there and move forward. And my supervisor, Gavin Butler, will talk more about one of these programs tomorrow. So just to finish, where to next? So we are developing a fishery management strategy for New South Wales. Within that will sit these species management plans, and that data we're collecting is going to feed into some sort of management plan, and I've included I don't know what that's called there, Pegasus or whatever it's called, but basically it's an amalgamation of different beasts, which is likely what our harvest strategies will be. They'll be an amalgamation of different types of strategies, and that's how we're going to move forward, including those stocking responses to drought and all that sort of stuff in it. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. Next, I'd like to welcome Martin Paish, who's the Director of the Sport Fishing Institute in British Columbia. Martin's presentation will showcase how catch and release information from a citizen science program has been used to bring about conservation and fishery outcomes in southern BC. So I'll get that up for you. Yes, yeah, that takes you forward. 2 seconds, it's just loading up.
Thank you very much for attending today. My name is Martin Paish, and I am Director of Sustainable Fisheries for the Sport Fishing Institute of British Columbia. I'm here to talk to you today about Avid Anglers, which is a citizen science program that we've embarked in collaboration with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. There's a lot to cover, so forgive me for speaking quickly and not getting into too much detail. It's going to be fairly high level. So what we'll talk about originally is the origins of the Avid Angler program, move into some of our sampling methods, current status, how we use the data, pros and cons, and then the future. So context, why would anglers be motivated to participate in a citizen science program like this? The graph you see here is for what we call Georgia Strait. So it's the southern inside waters of British Columbia. It's not the entire coast, but it is part of the coast that is in the closest proximity to our largest population centers, Vancouver, British Columbia, and Victoria, British Columbia. So you'll note that as you look, there's a precipitous drop in the sort of mid to late 90s, and it's kind of stabilizing and staying low. So, 80% decline in public fishing effort. Salmon catch has been even more. We'll get into that more later. And then why are these declines in opportunity and expectation happening? There's no doubt and there's no dispute that some key salmon stocks, particularly Chinook in British Columbia, are suffering conservation concerns right now. So it's not disputed. So the lack of scientific information at the appropriate scale isn't there. So in order to be adaptive in our management processes, we need the ability to move away from stocks of concern and into areas where they're not there. And so what we need is this finer spatial information. As we have more stocks of concern prevalent, we have increasing government risk aversion through the implementation of the precautionary principle in management. What that's ended up in is large temporal and spatial closures, in this case on the most popular sport fish in British Columbia in tidal waters, which is Chinook salmon. And in many of these areas close to population centers, we have non-retention of Chinook salmon from April 1st through to either July 15th, August 1st, or September 1st, which is the peak migration period for adults. It's challenging. So these decisions are creating disruption and acrimony between sectors. An example would be we don't have an effective allocation policy to deal with these kinds of depressed stock situations. So you get sectoral competition, you get people that are upset about the program, and so we need a way to try and work through that through the use of data. So that would be the Avid Angler. So what are the objectives of the Avid Angler program? Fishery stability is a key socioeconomic objective for all sectors. So it doesn't really matter whether you're a recreational fisherman trying to book a vacation well in advance, whether you're an Indigenous person wanting to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes, important cultural events like weddings, funerals, first fish ceremonies, or commercial fishermen trying to plan your fishing trip and be responsible in the way you plan your business. Fishery management should be based on available science, the best available science. Too often, we find that fishery management decisions are informed by public opinion rather than good data. That typically leads to bad decisions, and I'm sure we're not alone with that in British Columbia. Support science throughout the fish's lifestyle. So we tend to do a lot of sampling during peak angler periods. With salmon, that's usually when they're adults returning to the river. The largest specimens, they're mature, they're coming back to the river. We're talking about things like what we call micro-trolling, where we use little tiny lures and little tiny flashers to catch little tiny fish. So we're catching year-old, 2-year-old Chinook salmon rather than 4- and 5-year-old Chinook salmon. So you think a few centimeters rather than many. Users have a responsibility to provide the needed data. In British Columbia, we have a recreational fisheries vision, which is essentially a strategic plan for the growth and development of recreational fisheries in British Columbia over the next decade or so. One of the key principles in that is that fishermen have a responsibility to provide data. If we're going to enjoy access to public resources, fish are those, then we have a responsibility to provide data. Another layer on that is that those folks who make money off the industry, i.e. charter fishermen, lodges, guides, that kind of thing, actually have a higher responsibility to do it. So we also need to increase the focus on management methods that can provide that really delicate but necessary balance between conservation concerns and rebuilding on stocks of concern and the maintenance of social, cultural, and economic benefits associated with fishing activity. It's not an easy thing to do, but we have to try and do it. So the response is the Avid Angler program. Who are these guys? Well, we tend to find that they are avid anglers. They're experts. They spend a lot of time on the water. They are willing to be trustworthy in terms of data reporting. We can use fishing guides or regular anglers. It doesn't really matter. They're willing to work with government, which at times can be challenging with anglers, as you all know. So we have to have that trust-based relationship, that desire to non-strategically gather data and provide data. And one way that we can do that is through annual training. So what kind of results have these guys produced? So we've got 620 volunteers sampling both kept and released, and you'll notice that those are in block capitals. We'll get into that a little bit more later. But in total, since 2014 to 2021, we've collected over 45,000 DNA samples with this group. That's a powerful data set in that area at almost no cost to government. These are volunteers. They're actually going out on their own time, in their own boats, buying their own fuel to do this sampling on behalf of government. In contrast, we have a creel survey, like a lot of places do. 40 to 50 government creel survey observers have collected roughly the same amount of DNA samples at a cost of about $1 million a year. So this is a really high added value to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. If I had a pointer, I'd be able to point out, but you're looking at Vancouver Island there. That gap of water in between Vancouver Island and the mainland is Georgia Strait. That's the inside waters we're talking about. And you can look at the total number of samples, how much it increased in 2020. That's COVID years, right? We also encourage people in British Columbia to go fishing as a healthy, COVID-safe activity. We also got some serious management measures imposed in 2019 that increased sampling effort. So key strength, avid anglers are sampling releases. So we talked about it. In 2019 is when these sweeping non-retention measures kicked in. So you can see, looking at the graph, 2019, look at how release samples jumped right up and retained samples jumped right down. That's because we had non-retention, and anglers were understanding that that sampling release fish was becoming increasingly important, and we'll talk about that why in a second. So this is our sample form. Busy slide, sorry about that, some cool photos on it as well though, but we sampled the typical things you'd expect. Species, length, type of gear used, environmental conditions. You look on the right, you'll see some of our sampling kits. We use Wattman cards to preserve scale samples. So the scale samples represent our DNA and our scale for aging. And so we get both of these things in one shot. It's kind of a cool tool where you don't have to keep them cold or anything like that. And the protocol is important. In order to produce an unbiased sample, anglers have a choice. They either sample the first fish every day or all fish every day. We don't want them sampling the biggest fish because they know they're going to get their DNA results back, for example. So an example result, when we look at this, this is through DNA samples. So if you look at the chart on the right, it's just showing stock composition throughout years in Georgia Strait, different stocks, East Coast Vancouver Island, Fraser River Fall 4 sub 1s. The ones that are circled are the stocks of concern. Not surprising, they make up a small proportion of catch, but a small but important proportion of catch when you're trying to achieve zero impact. And that's the state that we're in right now. So being able to understand where these fish are and when they are where they are is what this data helps us to do. And so what are the results of using this kind of data? It's things like this. So you look again at a map of Vancouver Island. You look at these blue areas, the aquamarine blue areas. If you consider Georgia Strait and Juan de Fuca Strait, where the US border black line is, those are the migration paths of fish back to the Fraser River. Fraser River is where Vancouver is, a city roughly the size of Melbourne here. Victoria, where the World Recreational Fisheries Conference was in 2016, another 700,000-ish people. So you've got a lot of folks fishing. These are sheltered waters, they're accessible, lots of boat ramps, and a long history of fishing. So what we've been able to create here, and this is done in collaboration with the Sport Fishing Advisory Board of British Columbia and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, every part of this exercise has had government oversight. And the data is gathered by anglers, it's analyzed by government, so it's all partnership. So you can see we've created areas where there was no opportunity, where now there's some. They're off the main migration paths. 4 minutes. Thank you. I can get this done in that point of time. Avoidance based on prevalence is the key. So what that means is, I won't go backwards, I promise. But these areas that you're talking about use what we call mark selective fisheries. Mark selective fisheries is where we use an adipose fin clip, so a visual mark where an angler can distinguish a wild Chinook salmon that is stock of concern from an enhanced Chinook salmon that is produced in a hatchery designed for harvest. So that's why release samples are important. If we're releasing these fish, you heard some work earlier on about fishing-related incidental mortality in British Columbia. If we know how many are released, if we know what the incidental mortality rate is on these animals, then we can understand the impact of the stock in terms of an exploitation rate. Pros of citizen science anglers, citizen science in BC, it's cost effective, it keeps anglers engaged and motivated in management. These become leaders and communication pillars within the overall angling community, and it demonstrates a conservation attitude within the community. Cons, one of the troubling things we're dealing with right now, it kind of goes back to that technology creep slide. When you see 3,000 horsepower on the back of a boat, the first thing I thought about is, what is his fuel consumption per hour? And that's becoming tricky. The data's got to be used, and you demonstrate to you how it is. If you want to keep guys engaged, they need to know that their data is meaningful and that government is using it. Needs constant support. If we can't meet with these people, provide training, help them understand, do a 1 or 2 day workshop once a year to show them how the data rolls out, how we're using it, talk about the pros, the advantages and disadvantages in the way we're gathering it, they're going to lose interest, and we know that. So that helps you maintain constant standards. Future, how to engage, how to maintain engagement. We do this through these annual general meetings and workshops. These are people who are keen on not just fishing, they're keen on fishery management, they care about the future of the fishery. Sharing and validation of data. We share this data with all sectors. There is no secrets. Doesn't matter whether they're a competitive sector or not, it goes out to everybody. Combined with other methods like test fisheries to provide audits. Test fisheries are essentially groups of professional anglers that are going to go out with significant oversight from DFO to make sure that the data that we're receiving, not just through citizen science, but also through creel surveys, actually mirrors what people are seeing in a more tested method out there. We've talked about the potential to address time and area specific concerns, and we've talked about the need to increase release sampling, not just retained catch, in order to help demonstrate the advantages, I would suggest, of mark selective fisheries to enable us to avoid stocks of concern and provide opportunity and expectation on enhanced stocks. And the future, we're funding this thing is something that we'll just continue to work on. As some of you know, it's kind of an annual thing, but we'll keep at it. And I think that does it. Thank you for your time. You notice how beautiful British Columbia is to fish in. Photo taken last summer from my boat, and I got to tell you, I love my job.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of this afternoon's speakers. I think we don't have that much time because we were running behind in starting, but perhaps I'll get all the speakers just to sit down for, maybe we'll give it 2 minutes and just take 2 questions.
I've got a question for Martin, and it's around costs and how basically the citizen science, the use of anglers is a no-cost thing or a low-cost thing. I'm just thinking about training, about how the citizen science anglers are actually trained to take the thin clip or whatever it may be. Is there something there that sort of maybe is underfunded or requires more effort?
We do that through the use of volunteers actually as well. I mean, you know, again, this is collaboration with the regulator. So, you know, DFO provides the staff. They also right now, but it's on an annual basis through a contribution agreement. They actually, you know, will pay for the venue. They'll do a catered lunch, that type of thing, to bring everybody together so we can do that in kind of a group environment. And so, you know, when you're talking about funding through annual contribution agreements, that's dependent upon the whim of government. If we needed to, I think we could quite easily pull the various people together from in the recreational fishing industry to provide additional funding, and that's why I said stay tuned. It's something we have to deal with on an annual basis.
Yeah, my question or comments to Sean about all the effort creep stuff and how to actually deal with it. You know, I could say, you know, the easy way for some of the commercial fisheries is just go to quota, and then it doesn't matter anymore. But of course, doing that in the recreational fishery is a whole lot harder in multi-species kind of environment, and being able to report on that in a live way. So that's kind of out of the question. The other one, in terms of bringing in the models, is standardising your catch rate with a difference of effort as well, which we do for a lot of our commercial fisheries. Again, can't do that for recreational because of the data is limited, which is like a common theme all the time. So yeah, wondering, are you guys in America sort of starting to bring that kind of information in? You know, for example, for us in our one of our commercial trawl fisheries, you know, we basically have to get all the fishermen together to get them to agree how much better they think the effort's got. Has it gotten 10% better in the last 10 years? And that's kind of like the sticking point. When they agree on that, then you can sort of bring it in. But getting recreational fishers to agree, you know, that's so disparate, and say, oh, do you agree it's gone up this much? Because that means it's this much worse, which means we're going to this much more management action. So yeah, I guess it's not really helping anything, it's just more information, but like your thoughts on that. Yeah.
No, and that's like my talk. I have no conclusion. You know, that's what I wanted to reach out to you guys. You live this every day like I do. And I don't know. I think the future is, you know, it's not the government to regulate. And we've seen fishermen self-regulate more culturally, like properly handling fish to release. That's not regulated by government to keep your hands wet. That's you fishermen or our fishermen doing that themselves because they value the resource. And so maybe that is the approach with this sort of thing, and we can go from that point of view. But you're right, you know, it's like herding cats. You know, some of them, you know, they don't even go to public boat ramps, so they don't get our intercepts with, you know, people who are doing the creel surveys, like Martin said. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to have to be a cultural thing, but I would love to have this discussion, and maybe we could have, you know, a unified voice reaching out to fishermen. They've already demonstrated there's precedent set for doing that culturally responsible thing and valuing the resource. So I think that foundation is there, but I don't know.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks,
Oh,
Sean,
thanks.
Kevin, Nathan, and Martin. Those are great talks. A great way to end the day. And I guess everyone will just get ready for the dinner tonight. Gala dinner.
Thank you, Faith.
Thanks.